I, 27F, struggle with my husband, 32M, not wanting to help us financially. I never imagined my life turning out this way. Looking back, I remember the hopeful, naive girl I used to be, the one who believed in love, in shared dreams, in the promise of a future built together. I was only 17 when I met him, a young woman full of ideas, bursting with ambition, ready to conquer the world with a partner by her side. He was older, wiser, or so I thought, with an air of quiet confidence that drew me in. His words were smooth, his promises intoxicating, and I believed every single one. He painted a picture of stability, a future where we would grow together, achieve together, build something lasting, something that mattered. At first, everything felt like a whirlwind romance. He had dreams, or at least he spoke of them. He had plans, or at least he made me believe he did. I remember late nights spent talking about the life we would have, travels, a home filled with laughter, the careers we would build, the family we would create. It felt like a storybook beginning, the kind of love people write about in novels. I never questioned whether he would follow through on his words because I was too blinded by my own hopes, my own expectations. But reality has a way of stripping illusions bare. Slowly, piece by piece, the picture he painted started to crack. It wasn't immediate. No, it was insidious, small disappointments at first, little things I brushed aside. He would start something and never finish it. He would talk about opportunities but never take them. He would say he needed time, that things would fall into place eventually. And I believed him, again and again. Years passed, and I kept waiting. I supported him, encouraged him, even put my own aspirations on hold so he could find his footing. But he never did. The man who had once seemed so full of promise was still standing in the same place, making the same excuses. And yet, I stayed. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was fear of admitting I had been wrong. Then, our child came into the world, and everything changed. The moment I held that tiny, fragile life in my arms, something inside me shifted. It was no longer just about me or my misplaced faith in him. It was about this little person who depended on us, who needed stability, care, and a future. I thought maybe this would be the wake-up call he needed. Surely, fatherhood would ignite a fire within him. Surely, he would step up now. But he didn't. 3 months in, our bank account was empty, our bills unpaid, and I was faced with a brutal choice: stay home with my baby, or go back to work and leave her in his care. I agonized over it. Every fiber of my being screamed against the idea of leaving my child with him. Not because he didn't love her, he did, in his own way, but because deep down, I knew he wouldn't do what needed to be done. He would let the hours slip by, lost in his own world, while she cried, while she waited for someone to feed her, to change her, to soothe her. And yet, I had no choice. We were drowning, and I was the only one who could pull us to the surface. So I went back to work, each morning tearing myself away from my child with a pain so sharp it felt like I was being split in two. I counted the minutes until I could return home, each second stretching endlessly, my mind filled with the worst possibilities. What if she was left alone in her crib for hours? What if he forgot to change her? What if she cried and he did nothing? When I would finally get home, my worst fears would be confirmed. She would be in the same clothes, sometimes with a wet diaper, often unfed. The house would be in the same state I had left it in, dishes piled in the sink, clothes scattered on the floor. And he? He would be in bed or behind his computer, lost in whatever virtual world he had chosen over his real-life responsibilities. It infuriated me. It terrified me. But more than anything, it broke me. I tried to talk to him. I tried to explain. I pleaded, I reasoned, I argued. But he had excuses for everything. He was grieving, he said. He wasn't ready, he said. He needed time, he said. Time. How much more time could I give him? How much longer was I supposed to wait? We had a child who didn't understand delays, who needed food now, care now, love now. And yet, he remained stagnant, frozen in his grief, in his self-imposed helplessness. Money was another nightmare. I watched our finances dwindle, each month a desperate balancing act between bills, rent, groceries. He was content relying on social benefits, insisting it was enough. But it wasn't. Every month, we barely scraped by. Every month, I lived with the crushing weight of knowing that one unexpected expense could send us spiraling. And still, he refused to work. I tried to explain the importance of financial security, of stability. I pointed out how much extra money he could earn with a job, tax returns, vacation pay, bonuses. I showed him the numbers, laid it all out as clearly as possible. And still, he dismissed me. He made me feel as though I was overreacting, as though I was the one asking for too much. But I wasn't asking for luxuries. I wasn't asking for extravagance. I was asking for survival. For security. For a life where I wouldn't have to wonder whether we could afford to feed our child next week. I looked at other families, at the men in my own life, my father, my brother, my friends' husbands. They worked. They contributed. They shouldered responsibility. They didn't sit back while their partners carried everything on their own. And I resented him for it. I resented the fact that I was the only one fighting, the only one struggling, the only one sacrificing. I resented the fact that I had believed in him. Every night, when I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion weighing down on me like a boulder, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder how it had come to this. How had I ended up here, in a life that felt like a prison, shackled to a man who refused to move forward? How had I allowed myself to be dragged down with him? And worst of all, how long could I keep going before I finally broke? Because I could feel it happening. Piece by piece, the girl I used to be was crumbling. The woman who had once been full of dreams, of ambition, of hope, she was fading, replaced by someone who merely existed. Someone who survived, but no longer lived. And I didn't know how much longer I could bear it. There are days when I come home from work and step into what feels like the aftermath of an abandoned life. The house is still, suffocating in its silence, carrying the stale air of a place left untouched for hours. The curtains remain closed, casting dull shadows over the unmade bed where he has spent the entire day, swallowed by his own inertia. The dishes from breakfast, if he even bothered to make any, sit untouched in the sink, a thin film of dried food clinging to the plates. The floor is speckled with crumbs from the night before, laundry sits in the same spot I left it, and the air carries a mixture of dust and neglect, a physical manifestation of his absence in this home that we are supposed to share. And then there's our daughter. More often than not, I find her still in her pajamas, her diaper full, her hair matted from where she has been lying in the same position for hours. Sometimes she is quiet, resigned to her reality, playing alone with whatever toy happened to be within reach. Other times, she is fussy, restless from the lack of attention, the lack of care. My heart shatters every time I see her like that. I scoop her up, holding her close, trying to erase the hours of neglect with my presence alone, but deep down, I know it isn't enough. A child needs more than just a mother who tries to make up for everything in the few hours before bedtime. And still, he lays there. Most days, he doesn't even acknowledge that I've come home. The screen in front of him flickers, the glow of his computer illuminating his face, but his eyes are vacant, lost in a world that he chooses over reality. I could stand there for minutes, staring at him, waiting for him to look at me, to say something, anything. But he doesn't. If he does speak, it's usually a muttered complaint about how exhausted he is, as if lying in bed all day is some form of suffering, as if his lack of movement is a weight that only he bears. At first, I tried to be understanding. Grief is complicated, I told myself. His mother's passing was hard on him. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he just had to process things in his own way. But as the weeks stretched into months, I realized the truth. This wasn't new. This wasn't grief alone. This was who he had always been. His mother's death had simply given him an excuse. An excuse to do nothing. An excuse to retreat further into his self-imposed isolation. An excuse to lean even harder on the emotional and financial weight that I carried every single day. I tried to talk to him about it. I tried to tell him that I understood his pain, but that life had to keep moving. That our daughter needed him. That I needed him. I told him that I was struggling, that I couldn't do everything alone, that I was drowning under the weight of keeping us afloat. His response? He told me that I was selfish, that I only cared about money, that I didn't understand what it felt like to lose a mother, as if that justified his complete withdrawal from reality. He dismissed my concerns with the wave of a hand, as if my exhaustion, my stress, my overwhelming burden meant nothing. He told me that I was ungrateful, that I should be lucky he was even still here, as if his mere existence was some grand sacrifice I should appreciate. And the worst part? I started to believe him. I started to doubt myself. I started to wonder if I really was as cold and unfeeling as he made me out to be. Was I a terrible person for expecting him to contribute? Was I heartless for wanting him to at least try? But then, I would look at my daughter. And I would remember that this wasn't just about me. Because while I could grit my teeth and carry the weight of his failures, she couldn't. She was too young, too innocent, too undeserving of a father who chose to be absent even when he was physically present. I began to see the patterns more clearly, the way he had always been this way, long before grief gave him an excuse. He had never been reliable. He had never followed through. He had always found a way to shift responsibility away from himself, to make it seem as though the world was against him, as though he was some tragic figure incapable of changing his own fate. But the truth was, he didn't want to change. Because doing nothing was easier. Letting me carry everything was easier. Why would he fight for something when I was the one fighting for him? Why would he lift a finger when he knew I would pick up the pieces no matter what? And that realization, it broke me. Because I knew then that nothing I did would ever be enough. No amount of love, no amount of patience, no amount of effort would ever make him step up. He wasn't incapable. He wasn't broken beyond repair. He was choosing this. He was choosing to stay in bed while I worked. He was choosing to let his child go unfed for hours. He was choosing to let me struggle alone. And the worst part? I was choosing to let him. I was choosing to keep hoping when hope had long since withered. I was choosing to keep waiting for something that would never come. I was choosing to stay. And I didn't know if I could live with that choice any longer. There are nights when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I got here. How did I become this woman, the one who walks on eggshells in her own home, the one who chooses her words so carefully, so fearfully, just to avoid the storm that she knows is coming? The one who feels a tightness in her chest every time she hears his voice rise, who braces for the moment when the insults start pouring out like venom, burning, seeping into her skin, poisoning whatever strength she has left. I don't even recognize myself anymore. I used to be strong. I used to be confident. I used to believe in myself. But now? Now I flinch when he moves too suddenly, even though he has never laid a hand on me. Now I lower my voice when I talk about money, fearing the explosion that will follow. Now I have to force myself to breathe through the nausea that rises in my throat when I hear him say my name, because I know what's coming next isn't love. It isn't kindness. It's another reminder of just how little I mean to him. And the worst part? I still feel guilty. I still question myself. I still wonder if I'm overreacting, if I should be more understanding, if maybe, just maybe, I'm the problem. Because that's what he wants me to believe. That's what he has spent years conditioning me to think. That I'm selfish. That I'm ungrateful. That I'm cruel for asking him to be the man he promised me he would be. But I am not asking for anything extraordinary. I am asking him to be a father to his child. I am asking him to be a partner, not a burden. I am asking him to stop tearing me down when I am the only thing holding this family together. Yet, every time I bring up the simplest, most basic expectations, things any decent man should do without being asked, he twists my words, manipulates the conversation, turns himself into the victim, and me into the villain. It's always about money with you, he sneers, his voice dripping with resentment. No. It's not. It's about survival. It's about dignity. It's about the fact that I shouldn't have to be fighting this battle alone while he watches from the sidelines, unwilling to lift a finger to help. It's about the fact that while I am out there working, exhausted, struggling, desperate to make sure we have enough for rent and bills and food, he is lying in bed, blaming grief, blaming the world, blaming everything but himself. And when I push back, when I refuse to let him guilt me into silence, he becomes cruel. Words that no husband should ever speak to his wife spill from his mouth so effortlessly, so naturally, as if they hold no weight at all. As if they are just words, empty and meaningless, instead of the daggers they truly are. He calls me names that strip away my dignity, that reduce me to nothing more than something to be spat on, discarded, dehumanized. Dog. SL*T. Bad wife. The first time he said those words to me, I felt something inside me crack, a deep, sharp fissure splitting through my chest, cutting through my heart. But the second time? The third? The 10th? It started to feel normal. It started to feel expected. It started to feel like I had somehow earned it, like I had provoked it, like if only I had worded things differently, if only I had been softer, quieter, more agreeable, maybe then he wouldn't have said those things. Maybe then he wouldn't have looked at me with such disgust, such contempt. Maybe then he would still love me. But that's the lie, isn't it? Because no matter how much I twist myself into someone smaller, someone gentler, someone who caters to his every mood, it never stops. The insults, the anger, the weight of his resentment, it's always there, hovering over me, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me until I can barely breathe. And I try to remind myself that I am not the problem. That his grief, his struggles, his failures are not my fault. That I am allowed to want more, to expect more, to demand more from the man who is supposed to stand beside me, not crush me beneath his weight. But then reality sets in. Then payday comes, and I watch as every cent I've earned vanishes into bills, leaving just enough to scrape by, just enough to keep the lights on, to keep the roof over our heads, to keep our child fed. And some days, that isn't even enough. Some days, I sit at the table, staring at my bank account, calculating over and over again, trying to make the numbers work, trying to stretch a dollar into something more, something that can cover the gaps that are always there. Some days, I have to borrow. And I hate it. I hate the way it makes me feel small, dependent, like a failure. Because I know we shouldn't have to live like this. I know that if he would just do something, anything, we wouldn't be in this position. But he doesn't care. He tells me it's fine, that there's nothing wrong with borrowing, that everyone does it, that family is there to help. But that's not how I see it. I see it as another crack in the foundation of our already crumbling life. I see it as another reminder that I am the only one trying, the only one who worries, the only one who stays up at night, sick with anxiety, wondering how we will make it to next month. I see it as proof that he has no intention of changing, no desire to pull himself out of this cycle of excuses and stagnation. And yet, I stay. I stay because I don't know what else to do. I stay because leaving feels like an impossible mountain to climb. I stay because, after years of being torn down, I am not sure if I am strong enough to walk away. But I also know this. I cannot keep living like this. Because every day that I stay, I lose another piece of myself. And soon, there will be nothing left. There comes a moment in every slow-burning disaster where you finally realize you are standing in the wreckage, not the home you once built. It isn't sudden, not a singular defining event, but a quiet accumulation of moments that built into an unbearable weight pressing against your chest. It's the nights of crying in silence, the forced smiles for the sake of your child, the long hours at work where exhaustion is easier than going home to a man who barely sees you as a person anymore. I tell myself I have been patient. I have been understanding. I have given him the benefit of the doubt more times than I can count. I have waited for the grief to lessen, for the depression to pass, for the man I fell in love with to finally wake up and take responsibility. But the truth is, I have been waiting for a ghost. A version of him that never really existed. I see that now. I see it in the way my body tenses when I hear his voice, in the way I dread the sound of his footsteps, in the way I calculate every conversation before I have it, knowing how easily his words can twist reality, how easily he can make me feel like I am the villain in a story I never wanted to be part of. And I see it most clearly in our daughter. She is too young to understand the weight of what is happening, but I know she feels it. She sees the way I flinch when he yells, the way my hands shake when I pick her up after work, the way the house is cold and lifeless when I am not there. She is learning, without realizing it, that this is what love looks like: a mother who carries everything and a father who watches from the sidelines. And I cannot allow that. I cannot let my daughter grow up in a home where love is conditional, where neglect is excused, where anger and blame fill the spaces where laughter and warmth should be. I cannot let her think that this is normal, that this is love. So I make a plan. I do it quietly, methodically, the way I have learned to do everything over these past years. I gather documents. I set aside money, what little I can spare. I speak in hushed tones with my parents, laying the groundwork for the inevitable. They don't hesitate. They tell me I have a home waiting for me, that I will not be alone, that they will help in any way they can. And for the first time in a long time, I feel a flicker of relief, of something resembling hope. But leaving is not easy. Because even though I know it is the right thing to do, guilt gnaws at me like a living thing. I picture him alone, in the house we once shared, aimless, broken, blaming me for his downfall. I know he will spiral. I know he will call me selfish, tell everyone who will listen that I abandoned him when he needed me most. And a part of me, the part that still wants to believe he can be saved, wants to stay. But I also know this. If I stay, I will lose myself completely. And more than that, I will fail my daughter. The night before I leave, I sit on the edge of the bed and watch him, wondering if he will notice. If he will sense that something is different, that the woman who has been begging for scraps of love is finally walking away. But he doesn't. He barely looks at me. And that, more than anything, tells me I am making the right choice. I pack while he sleeps, shoving our lives into bags with shaking hands, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. When I lift my daughter into my arms, she stirs but doesn't wake, nestling against me with the trust only a child can have. I press my lips to her forehead, whisper a promise that things will be better now. That I will make sure of it. And then I walk out the door, into the night, into the unknown. I don't look back. Because I already know there is nothing left for me there.